Good morning, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your Memorial Day weekend. Are you ready for chapter 11 and part 18 of SeaMan? Let's begin. Ocean view! Exclamation. The joy. October through November 6th, 1805. I don't know why my stomach isn't as happy as the rest of me, York said thoughtfully. 'Cause the rest of me sure is pleased to be on the other side of those big mountains. George Shannon laughed and tossed a stick to SeaMan, who caught it before it touched the ground. Wait a couple days, Shannon said. Your stomach is still homesick for buffalo sausage and roasted deer meat. York groaned. Let's don't talk about food right now, Mr. George. As soon as I'm thinking I might want some, my stomach starts aching again. SeaMan sat in front of Shannon, the stick in his mouth and the tail wagging. SeaMan had already adjusted to the new diet of dried fish, roots, and berries. So had young Shannon and a few of the other men. You'll get used to the new food soon, Shannon said. SeaMan padded around camp like a 4-footed nurse. If a sick man groaned in misery, SeaMan nuzzled the patient's face. Sometimes a dizzy man would call the dog over and make a shaky attempt to sit up by holding on to SeaMan's big body. At night, SeaMan settled down beside Lewis, and the stick captain snuggled up. That doesn't make sense. And the sick captain snuggled up to the dog's warm fur. While recovering from their stomach troubles, the explorers camped near the Nez Perce village. The Indian squaws fed them. As soon as some of the men were healthy, the Indians pointed out the edible plants in this new country. The Nez Perce Indians could not understand the language spoken by any of the explorers, not even the Shoshone or the Hidatsa languages of Sacagawea and Old Toby. Nor could they understand the explorers' sign language, the silent hand signals used by most of the Plain Indians to communicate between tribes. So the explorers and the Nez Perce developed their own simple hand signals. The Nez Perce advised the explorers about the route to the Western Sea by drawing pictures in the dirt or in the air. Since the explorers had not carried their heavy boats across the mountains, they needed to begin making new canoes as soon as some of the men were strong enough to work. While Lewis recuperated, Clark gathered the healthiest members of the Corps for this task. SeaMan jogged along between Shannon and Coulter as they followed Twisted Hair. The old chief of the Nez Perce village had led them to a spot where large ponderosa pine trees grew. The explorers chose 5 thick, straight trees and cut them down. They chopped off their branches and stripped off their bark. Then Twisted Hair showed them how to make fire along the length of the tree trunk to burn out the wood in the center. The men camped by the fires and kept them burning day and night. SeaMan returned to the main camp to sleep beside Lewis during the night, but in the morning he ran through the cool woods to visit the men making canoes. The canoe camp smelled of pine needles and wood fire. One morning, Clark fastened the saddlebags around SeaMan's back and packed some roots for the canoe makers to eat. When SeaMan bounded into canoe camp, Shannon opened the saddlebags and found the roots. Good boy, SeaMan. You're the delivery dog for our camp. That evening, the canoe makers sent a note back in SeaMan's saddlebag to report that the boat making was going quickly. Shannon had been amusing himself in the evenings by whittling a little toy for Pomp out of a scrap of pine. It looked like a dog with a big head, thick fur, and small hanging ears, a likeness of SeaMan. He packed the toy in SeaMan's saddlebags. When SeaMan returned to the main camp that night, Clark opened SeaMan's saddlebags. He took out the little wooden dog and smiled. Look, Janie, he said to Sacagawea, calling her by nickname, the nickname he gave her. Here's the little SeaMan for Pomp to play with. Sacagawea showed the little carving to Pomp, who reached for it with 2 chubby hands. He waved it happily in the air and then stuck the wooden dog's leg in his mouth. Finally, the canoes were finished. Using the Indian shortcut, the explorers had hollowed out 5 canoes in 10 days. Most of the men were feeling better. the Corps of Discovery was ready to continue traveling. The captain asked the villagers if they would care for the expedition's horses until the following spring when the explorers expected to return, and the Nez Perce agreed. Before leaving, the explorers branded their horses so that they would be able to recognize them. Twisted Hair offered to go with the Corps as a guide through the lands of the Nez Perce. Since this mighty tribe and its relatives spread across many villages covering hundreds of miles, the captains eagerly accepted his offer. Sliding their canoes into Clearwater River, the explorers waved goodbye to the kindly Nez Perce villagers on the afternoon of October 7th. They covered 20 miles before stopping for evening camp. "Now this is my kind of travel," York declared. "I just stick my paddle in the river and feel the currents push up and downstream. We are really moving, like the birds in the sky. We just watch the trees go by." "You said it," Coulter exclaimed. "We're moving more swiftly than any horses could run." The men were thrilled. This was the first time they had traveled with river currents since leaving Ohio River in November of 1803, almost 2 years earlier. They had forgotten how easy it was to paddle with the current. SeaMan sat near the bow of the canoe, stuck his furry face out and gulped the wind. The shaggy fur on his chest blew in the wind. When he opened his mouth and let his tongue hang loose, he looked like he was laughing. The sight of him made John Coulter think of the delights of a hunt on a breezy fall day. It made Sacagawea remember her childhood when she ran carefree along the banks of the Missouri. George Shannon simply wished he had been born a puppy. The Shoshone guide, Old Toby, did not share the explorer's enthusiasm for the swiftly moving rivers. He clenched his jaw and sat unsmiling through the few days of river travel. His eyes looked longingly at the trees beside the river. He refused to speak when Sacagawea asked if he was feeling well. One seaman sat beside him and nuzzled his arm, but Old Toby clutched the side of the rocking boat and turned his face away. Then one evening, Old Toby ran off without saying goodbye or asking for his pay. Captains wanted to send a man after him to deliver his earnings and their thanks for guiding them through the Rocky Mountains, but Twisted Hair advised them to let the poor fellow go. Captain Lewis was still feeling weak and sickly. He sat beside SeaMan in the canoe and leaned against the dog's warm, solid body. As SeaMan sniffed the air, Lewis dozed. On October 10th, the Corps camped where the Clearwater River flows into the Snake River. Local Indians sold the explorers dried fish and dog meat. Most of the men thought the dog meat tasted delicious because it was more tender than the elk and the deer meat. Captain Lewis was just regaining his appetite, and he relished the meat. The only memory of the group who found the dog meat distasteful, the only member of the group that found the dog meat distasteful was Captain Clark. Although he longed for the taste of meat, Clark just could not get used to the idea of eating dog meat. By the time the canoe reached a long stretch of rapids on October 13th, Lewis's energy had returned. "What do you think, Meriwether?" Clark asked as they walked along the riverbank to survey the rapids below them. "Can the canoe make it through the white water, or should we portage?" Lewis studied the foamy water rushing downstream. "I think we can steer around the boulders, and I don't see any big drops. Let's try it," Lewis said. "We've been making such good progress, and the men are eager to reach the sea. A portage will slow us down." Clark looked at the swift white water and hesitated. "We've got a lot to lose in these rapids, Meriwether. If we portage, all we have to lose is a little time." "Let me try it with 2 of the canoes. If I can make it through, then you follow with the rest." Clark was still undecided. "We won't put the non-swimmers on the lead canoes," Lewis urged, "or the journals or the most valuable baggage, and I'll take SeaMan with me. If one of the canoes capsizes, he'll pull the men to shore." Clark was doubtful, but he agreed to give it a try. His group, which included the non-swimmers and Charbonneau's family, watched as the first two canoes slid into the rushing water. Clark paid careful attention to the route that the lead canoes took through the rapids, paddling around the boulders and gliding over small drops. When the first group ran smoothly through the rapids, Clark's group eagerly ran for their canoes. As soon as Lewis's boat were past the rapids, they pulled to shore to wait for Clark's group. While Clark led the three remaining canoes into the water, Lewis walked back upstream with SeaMan, a few strong swimmers, and some rope. They ran along the banks as Clark's canoe rode the rapids so they could help if there was a mishap. But Clark's canoe ran the rapids without any problems. Phew! The canoe seemed to fly downstream on the Snake River, passing between Stark Canyon walls and through swift, bubbling rapids. Every time the explorers ran the rapids, they were taking dangerous chances. The dugout canoes did not handle well. They overturned easily, took in water, and slammed against rocks. Sometimes baggage was damp or pieces fell out, but the men were delighted with their speed, so they were willing to take the risks. Whew, lots of rapids on that Snake River. The group passed the village of the Nez Perce and their relatives, the Yakima and Walla Walla Indians. Oh, we're familiar with those names here in Oregon, right? These tribes are part of the same Indian nation, and they spoke languages similar to the Nez Perce. All of the Indians welcomed the explorers because of their guide, Twisted Hair. The captain held meetings with the chiefs of the villages, gave speeches, and passed out medals. Since the Corps of Discovery had passed beyond the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, the explorers were no longer in the territory owned by the United States. In fact, none of the white men's nations claimed this land. The captains hoped to establish trade between their country and these Indians before England, Canada, or Spain was able to make contact. Indeed, the explorers were establishing trade as they passed. It would slow their progress to send out hunters, so the captains traded with the Indians for food. The Corps of Discovery was moving faster than it had ever traveled before. Everybody's spirits were high. In the evening, Crozat played his fiddle around the campfire, and the men danced. Local Indians joined them for these parties. York danced his jigs to the delight of the Indians of the West. Sacagawea let Pomp crawl between the men seated around the campfire. The 8-month-old baby had just figured out how to creep around, and he gurgled with pride whenever he was allowed to test his new skills. As soon as Sacagawea put the baby on the ground, SeaMan moved to his side. The big dog positioned himself between the fire and the child. If Pomp started to crawl beyond the ring of people seated around the campfire, SeaMan nudged him back into the circle. Whoops, Captain Clark loved to watch little Pomp. "Your son is a born explorer, Janie," he said to Sacagawea, but he'll never explore any further than the campfire if SeaMan has his way. Look at how that dog keeps an eye on him. Who would think a dog that hunts as well as a wolf would become a tender-hearted nursemaid at the sight of a baby? Lewis smiled. "Why, William, I believe we could say the same thing about you. You've got such a soft spot for this baby. It wouldn't surprise me if you find yourself a wife and become a family man just as soon as we get back in the United States." On October 15th, the explorers could see mountains in the distance. The next day, the Corps of Discovery reached another river. According to Twisted Hair, this was the mighty river that flowed into the Pacific Ocean. Anybody know the name? The captain knew this must be the Columbia River from reports of the United States sea captains who sailed to the west coast of North America. "Look here, Meriwether," called Clark. "This river is so clear you can see pebbles, even grains of sand on the bottom." The group made camp for 2 days to explore the area around this famed river. Now that they had reached the Columbia River, they knew they would be able to find the Western Sea. "Feast your eyes on all that salmon," exclaimed Lewis, looking into the river. "Have you ever seen so many fish?" Most of the salmon had just spawned and were dead or dying, but SeaMan splashed into the river and swam downstream. When he returned, he was holding a large, wiggling salmon. He shook the water off his coat, then trotted over to York, carrying the treasure proudly in his mouth. "You get me a couple more of these big, juicy ones, SeaMan," York said, kneeling to take the fish. SeaMan wagged his tail, his tongue hanging out, and his bright eyes focused on York's face. He looked like he was grinning. We're going to have some fresh fish for supper tonight, fried crispy on the outside and juicy on the inside. Now that will be fine eating." York pointed at the river. "Go ahead, SeaMan. Get me some more of these fish." SeaMan woofed happily and bounded back into the river. Okay, we're going to stop there. So, our heroes have found the Columbia River. Very exciting. I'll be back with part 19. My Kindle reads 2 hours more in this book, so I think I read 8 more times. I think we will just slide by before the end of the year. Take care, kids.